This is Delegate Brian Crosby from St. Mary's County, the Mother County, and you're listening to the Conduit Street Podcast, the best source of information on what's happening in Annapolis.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson and Drew Jabin joining us tonight for the second installment of the Conduit Street Podcast After Dark. We tried this last week. It seemed pretty successful. Michael, we got some good feedback on it. What do you think about episode number 2? Just sort of a, rewind of the week and of the day. And again, the whole idea here is normally we get to do this during session. We get to sit down at the end of a long day. That's sort of what we're doing here, and we're going to recap the week. And it was a very interesting day as well. But what have you heard about? I'm sure you've gotten a ton of feedback on the After Dark installment.
Well, I think we sort of dropped a few hints about the nature of how we're trying to do the pod this way. So maybe it's a little bit different approach. And if there's a few more giggles and whatnot along the way, I don't think there's anything terribly wrong with that. I mean, our brand is sort of nerd. So if we lighten up a little bit, maybe that's a good thing on balance. And I don't know, we have a good influence on that front for this round, I think.
Well, I think one way to get away from that nerd brand is we have Drew Jabin with us. She's super smart, but I don't think she's a nerd like we are. Drew, thank you so much for taking your evening and joining us on the Conduit Street Podcast After Dark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here for one of these After Dark things. I know I listened last week and it sounded like so much fun. I just couldn't help but be a part of it this week.
I love it.
Michael, today was Police Day in the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate. I know that you were in there, you were testifying on a bill or two in JPR, so you listened to a lot of the back and forth, and there are some big bills, high-profile issues. I tried to listen in on some of it. It's fascinating stuff, but generally, what's your vibe after today? I mean, you're probably tired because it's a lot of back and forth on a lot of these bills, but I mean, what's your general takeaway from today in JPR?
I probably have a few things for the download here. I will say, I mean, first of all, I feel tired, but I got to think that the committee chair, Senator Will Smith, has got to be super tired. He spent the whole day on camera, sort of on point. He seems to be like, running the Zoom and unmuting people and so forth himself to try and keep things running. I mean, I know he's got staff that are helping out with things, but trying to keep track of calling all the witnesses and so forth. And I don't think I saw him ditch for even 10 minutes the entire day. This is a pretty long day. So hats off to him and his colleagues on the committee for getting through a lot of content. I mean, we knew coming into this session that police issues and concerns about social justice were going to be on the short list of things that everyone was paying attention to, right? Back in October, November, December, there was push. Maybe we'll even do a special session. Now we think we can get this focused and do this during the regular session, but we knew there'd be a lot of attention on this stuff anyway, right? So that's not just me being immersed in these issues. You guys were hearing that too leading up, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's no surprise to anybody around town. This is a national movement. Many states are reckoning with these issues. JPR is no stranger to long days in committee. JPR after dark, right? I mean, that was a thing, and it's probably still will be a thing. But yeah, I think, one of the things I'm interested in, Michael, is LEOBR, Leober, regardless of how you say it. That's right. A phrase that everybody's heard lately. So just briefly, can you talk about what that's for, what it means, and then what the ideas are, how to move forward with LEOBR or not?
Right. So I don't know. It's a lot to try and pull together here. So I'll try and do a fair job. But the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, LEOBR, is a set of state laws that basically say we know that our law enforcement officers, police, sheriff's deputies, and the like, we know they're put into situations where, that's a position of public trust, but it's also a really sensitive job. You go out and you put your hands on people, and the arrest process requires a lot of extra training, but it's a sensitive thing, and people feel like their interactions with the police are bad, and that becomes a problem. They file complaints, they make grievances, and we know this happens a lot. Maryland, I think I heard multiple times today, was the first state to create a statewide Bill of Rights for law enforcement officers, basically saying if you're facing allegations that you roughed somebody up or that sort of thing, then you're entitled to some special protections before you get disciplined, before you get fired from your job, or you have an official discipline decision, you get demoted, or all those sorts of things. Basically, the LEOBR is a bunch of special protections. Really, a lot of people are misunderstanding this, I think. Really, this is like internal to the police department stuff. This isn't about whether you go to jail for a criminal offense. If you were a police officer and you killed someone and it's determined you acted criminally, that's actually a whole separate thing. But the LEOBR is supposed to be about how easy is it to discipline officers who are accused of bad conduct. The fight today was the first installment of legislation to say, let's basically wipe that out and allow our local police agencies to come up with their own processes, and we'll give some general guidance on what those ought to look like, but the state shouldn't have a big role there in providing these extra assurances and extra protections for the officers. I mean, that's really the gist of the highest profile bill that they discussed today.
So I think one of the big takeaways, at least for me, is that there's always the two sides to the story, right? And that's on all of these bills.
Exactly right. That was a recurring theme for the day, that if you were listening to testimony on multiple different bills dealing with police procedures and so forth, it would be really easy to fall in love with the arguments of the first side, and then you hear the second side, and then you start scratching your chin thinking, well, actually, I kind of get that point of view too. I mean, I'm not trying to weigh in and say I've got this all figured out, because these issues are not ones that I'm deeply familiar with, but I'll say there's reasons why a lot of this stuff exists, and there's reasons why a lot of people are anxious about it. So, we've seen these terrible individual circumstances of this officer in one state or another who does this thing, or people being killed at the hands of police officers, and we go back and we say, well, did we do the right kind of training? Did we have the right kind of policies? Did we do the right kind of screening? And then what happens to the officer afterward? And I don't know. I have sympathy for the argument that we've got to change this. We've got to make things move fast. I'm so angry that these cops, in the situation I heard about from another state, I'm so angry that they haven't been charged with murder or they haven't been fired from their job. I got sympathy for that. But then you hear some representatives from the FOP and the groups who represent officers, and they say, you got to be careful here, because it doesn't serve anybody's interest if you empower the chief of police or the sheriff with sort of completely unilateral discipline that they can just take out grievances on an officer unfairly. That you need to have some sort of process, like a trial board or like a larger committee of people who decide, do you file administrative charges? Did the person actually violate conduct and other things like that? And I don't know. I mean, I think a reasonable person can have sympathy for both of those points of view, that I want swift justice, but I do want things to be treated fairly. There was an awful lot of that, I think, among committee members today on Big Police Day.
Right. And it's always interesting. This is probably one of the most complicated policy areas. And again, it's not easy stuff. That's why so many states are reckoning with this issue. And Michael, my takeaway is just because the bill hearing is over in the Senate, now we still have stuff to happen in the House, right? They're going to have their own big police day too. But just because the bill hearing is over in the Senate, that doesn't mean that the only question now is whether or not the bill passes. That's often the case, right? Oh my gosh, is the bill going to come out? Are they going to move it? Now there's going to be more work groups, more folks engaged, stakeholders at the table. And I think the big thing here is trying to find a middle ground. And it sounds easier than it is, but they're looking for compromise. They're looking to make some substantive changes, but they also know that, they understand, I think what you just said, that there are arguments on the other side to say you can't go too far. You have to have some of these protections in place, because if you don't, it's going to make things really difficult for law enforcement generally.
That was definitely a key part of today's conversation that made things manageable on time for the bill hearing was multiple stakeholders, some of the advocacy groups who are asking for sort of bold social change to affect the rules around policing, but then also like the chiefs of police and the sheriffs. You can see their point of view as they want to be able to manage effectively their own employees and staff and their own departments. And then the officers and their representatives saying, we want this to be an attractive and productive career. You want good cops to want to stay cops. You have sympathy, I think, for all of that. I will say the Senate had worked on these issues months in advance. They had gone through sort of some pro forma bill hearings on preliminary ideas back in the fall. So some of that showed that there's been work leading up to today. Number of the stakeholders came together and said, we're willing to support this bill. We have a few issues, or we have some amendments, or we have some changes. And I think that documents the progress they've made since back in the summer and fall. So work to be done. And you're right. Sometimes you go to a bill hearing and your only question is, well, are the votes there for that bill to pass? This one, I think the smart money is that something will pass this year, but even the Senate on its own proposals has work to do, and they acknowledge that today. We're going to bring together work groups and start talking through this beginning on Monday. But at the same time, the House of Delegates has a very different looking bill as their starting point for their biggest, broadest bill. It has some of the same tenets and some of the same concepts, but then a bunch of other things that the Senate hasn't even gotten into. So the Senate is still working on their piece. The House is going to take up and probably go through a similar process with their piece. There's a lot more to be done here. And maybe in the space of 21 days, that can all come together, but that feels like it's going to take some push and pull and negotiation and give and take and that sort of thing. So work to be done here.
So it sounds like there's a lot going on, obviously. Were there any other interesting bills today? Like, what were you in JPR for?
Yeah, actually, I don't know that it's super interesting, but it's sort of on the periphery of these fights over police discipline is another issue that some would say is very much related to police issues, and that is, well, how do you promote accountability when something does go wrong? When someone is hurt by a police officer or by a public figure, there are state laws that deal with the circumstance of a lawsuit. If you want to sue the county or your city or the state government, how do you go about doing that? And without getting too technical, there's this sort of big trade-off that's been in Maryland law and in most places for a long time that it doesn't make sense to sue the individual officer and try and get a bunch of money from one person who wouldn't be able to satisfy a judgment of whatever, $500,000 or whatever. So you go after the police department, or effectively you go after the county or the sheriff or your city. The laws that govern that are one of the subjects where we have advocates and lots of trial lawyers saying it's time to expose local governments to higher lawsuit levels. Let's make them more accountable for the actions of their employees, and in particular, their police officers. And that's a way to promote good behavior. So that was one side of the argument on a bill that I testified on today, to basically, the bill would say, let's expose the governments to bigger lawsuits as a way to promote best practices.
Yeah, and Michael, I mean, I was listening to that testimony, and I take umbrage with the fact that the argument of, well, if we made them, be on the hook for more money, the police would act better. They would be on their best behavior. This idea that because the advocates feel like these caps are too low, like they can't sue the county for enough money, the police officers and whomever, this is not just about police, but county employees or whomever are just running around and they're acting reckless and don't care. But somehow if you raise the caps and you could sue the county for more money, that would change behavior. I don't follow that at all.
Yeah, I don't either, and that was part of the testimony, in part from our sister organization, the Maryland Municipal League. I thought did a good job making that point, that it's not like we've got, if today was Police Day, this bill doesn't affect just police, but it was held on Police Day, so that's what everybody was thinking about. But it's not like you've got a town or a county who has decided, oh, what the heck, we'll just pay for all these lawsuits because the amount we pay, an $800,000 per suit limit means we don't have to worry about that. We'll write $800,000 checks all day. We won't bother to train our officers or have them follow codes of conduct and get educated and so forth. Like, we're doing those things. Yeah, it's not like we don't take the business of government or even the business of policing seriously. So I don't like that suggestion that, we're doing a bad job, but we'll start cleaning up our act if we're exposed to bigger lawsuits. I'm not buying that. There's more to the debate than that, but we'll see where this goes. There were an awful lot of people in some pretty snappy looking suits talking about, the importance to advance justice and get larger settlements and larger judgments for their clients. And I get it. I get the nature of how these debates go. This will be another one. We'll see how it plays out.
We touched last week on broadband. This is another one where we know this is one of the biggest issues this session. And Drew, you are our broadband aficionado. You actually wrote the MACo initiative bill. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we know there are lots of different ideas out there floating around, multiple pieces of legislation. What's the latest? Some of these bills have had hearings. You've been there for those. What's the vibe out there when it comes to broadband? Give us the landscape.
So broadband is just such a hot topic right now in the General Assembly. I feel like I have to say this every time, but it's so true that there's residents struggling to connect in every single county for telework, telemedicine, school. So everyone's getting in on the broadband action right now, I feel like. So currently, Delegate Krim has a broadband bill, and then there's also Delegate Learman and Senator Elfreth have a broadband bill, which both are aimed at kind of creating a statewide office to promote and expand affordable broadband in Maryland. And then also Senator Hester and Delegate Feldmark have graciously offered to sponsor MACo's broadband initiative bill, which we're calling the Building Out Broadband Act of 2021. So it's not out of drafting yet, but it has some super fun components. So there's going to be a dig once policy, digital inclusion fund piece, and also language that authorizes counties to kind of help fast track permitting, basically speeding up the process.
So I know, Drew, that in Maryland, it's difficult for the legislature to go and spend money. We have a weird budget process in Maryland, and so it's not really a simple thing to say, let's do money for this and let's do money for that. So the first bill you mentioned sort of creates a state entity that will, be sort of the shepherd and ringleader of bringing everybody's efforts together, and that sounds good. But I think the counties are going to support those bills. But we're also interested in the pieces you got to. You mentioned a dig once policy, and that sounds a little more nuts and bolts. Tell us what is this about?
So a dig once policy, it's really common sense legislation. So it's really inexpensive during construction projects to install empty conduit. And then future expansion will be a lot cheaper because you've already lowered the cost of the expensive digging for the providers.
So someday we might want fiber optic out this way. So rather than dig up the road again to do that in a few years or whatever, let's put some extra pipes under this new road. It'll be ready to go when the time comes.
Exactly. They're already digging it up. Why not put the conduit in?
Yeah, it's a forward-thinking idea. I know that this is something that other states and maybe counties and municipalities have undertaken, and it seems to be working well. But to me, it's common sense, right? If we're going to dig up a right-of-way, we might as well have some list where we call a bunch of people and say, hey, by the way, we're digging this up. So if you guys need to get in here and you want to install some conduit, let's do it now so we don't have to do it again. That to me just is really forward thinking, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's a way to speed up the process, like you said, because we need to get broadband now. We need to get everybody connected. Obviously it's going to take longer than, a few months or years even, but the idea here, I think, is to get the ball rolling. And Drew, you mentioned multiple proposals. It sounds like the two similar bills were already heard. I think our bill is coming out of drafting very, very soon. So the hearings, how did the hearings go? I don't think anyone is really opposed to these ideas generally, right? And so the bill hearings, I know you were there for the first two you mentioned. What was the vibe there? I mean, is it a kumbaya?
That's a good way to put it. I think it was a very excited vibe. Everyone wants this. Everyone knows it's a good idea. It's just about making sure that we get there the right way.
And these bills really aren't competing with one another. It's not like you have to choose whether to create the new broadband office or you can do the things that are in the MACo bill with the Dig Once policy and a digital inclusion fund. It's not like you have to say A or B. It's possible we come out of this session with sort of a basket of different approaches all pointing in the same direction. Is that right?
Yes, that's definitely correct. And that's why I love our broadband initiative so much, because it's all about the goal, which is to get everyone in Maryland access to be able to be in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's such an important component of our daily lives. And so, yes, I'm excited. I think everybody's on board with this generally. It's just a matter now of, how do you craft the final bill to include a lot of these great ideas? So we'll look forward to updates from you throughout session on how that's going. But I think some room for optimism when it comes to broadband. And I want to get into another quick issue here. We've talked about cannabis and adult use cannabis many times on this podcast. It's an intriguing and interesting debate with multiple layers. And I think the last time we talked, Michael, there's a big question about, look, Maryland is moving in the direction of legalizing and regulating adult use cannabis. We saw a House bill this year. Then we saw a Senate bill. And Michael, the sponsor line is massive on that bill.
I mean, first of all, this is like one of the games you play when you try and do political work in a state legislature. Is you get to know the legislators, you get to know who's interested in various topics and so forth, and then it's a noteworthy thing who is the sponsor or who are the sponsors on a particular bill. So, and this idea of Maryland getting in line with, I've lost count of how many states have decided to legalize cannabis for adult use, not just for medical card holders like we already do, but to go full on and say this is something that if you're of age, you should be able to use it. Everybody's interested in this topic, and we are too, but watching the sponsor line in the Senate was revelatory this year, right?
Right. So you have the Senate president on the bill. You have the chair of the Budget and Taxation Committee on the bill. We should say that Senator Brian Feldman is the lead sponsor. He's vice chair of the Finance Committee. You have Senator Will Smith, chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee in the Senate, and some others. But just so many committee chairs, and of course, Senator Ferguson, the president of the Senate. Usually you can look at a sponsor line like that and say, wow, this bill is going to move. But the biggest questions here for me, and again, this is stuff we've talked about before, is do you do this through legislation? One state has done that, Michigan. Most states, though, have put this question on the ballot. So, Michael, okay, now we have a House bill, we have a Senate bill, we have a massive sponsor line on the Senate bill. That is still the question, though, right? Talk a little bit about the balance here of why you do it through a bill or why you wouldn't just go ahead and put it on the ballot and let the people decide in the next election.
I think this is complicated on a number of levels, but fundamentally, what you're talking about is creating a state law that basically is more permissive than the federal law. That marijuana and cannabis are specifically on, I think it's a Schedule 1 controlled substance under federal law and has been through our lifetimes. So to the extent that states have said, as a practical matter, there's no federal enforcement of these laws, they leave it to the state. That's how you saw jurisdictions start to say, we want to authorize this for people with medical conditions, and then eventually we want to authorize this just for any adult to use. And the premise there is, the FBI just doesn't have the personnel to bang on your front door and break up a party and then arrest you for buying, selling, possessing, using marijuana, right? So as a practical matter, it's against federal law, but you have states that have basically said it's legal here because the feds don't really do that stuff. And so here you are in Washington State or Colorado, or we talked to our counterpart from Arizona where they had just passed it and so forth. So, District of Columbia has had this law for some time. So, there's plenty of dots on the map where states have done this, but that makes this, I think, a trickier thing to pass than just merely, okay, we've decided to change, the speed limit on a certain road or whatever. Just seems like it's a weightier policy. So, sometimes there's a political advantage to saying, let's let the citizens decide. And what we know from experience in virtually every state is you put it on the ballot and it'll pass.
Right. You certainly get some cover. And, also, yes, there are so many other issues here, socioeconomic issues, people, the mass incarceration for folks who have been locked up for possession of cannabis, marijuana. There's so many issues to untangle. So that's interesting by itself. Ultimately, yes, you could pass a bill this year, but also you could do it next year and put it on the ballot. I think that the Senate sponsor line is really what threw me for a loop. I was sort of in the lane where, okay, well, they're probably just going to wait to put it on the ballot. But yeah, Drew, about all these other issues when it comes to employment and employers, and it's illegal federally, but some states allow it. There are all kinds of issues, right, that have to be solved, particularly when it comes to employment stuff and what the relationship between the employer and employee is when it comes to, I have a medical cannabis card, or I'm in a state where it's legal, but federally it's still illegal. You deal with that stuff too a lot.
Yeah, there's definitely been a couple bills that I've seen in this year kind of dealing with the employee benefits and relations issues of it all. So I know there's one that basically says you can't take adverse actions against an employee based on their ability to use medical cannabis or their positive drug test. The issue with that is that there's no test that definitively says whether they tested positive and they used it a couple of days ago, or if they test positive and they are currently impaired on the job. So that's a huge issue for employers.
There's also an issue where if you receive federal funding, like many states and local governments do, you could be in some peril if you're not enforcing, the federal laws when it comes to cannabis use.
Right. So you may, in order to receive certain federal grants and support, particularly if you're a police department, back to a recurring theme, but if you're in the law enforcement business, you may have a strong federal incentive to have a strict zero tolerance drug-free workplace kind of policy. And that may be what the federal government expects of you because of the federal law. And so how do you square a state law with that? For the most part, I don't think the big push is to try and make a workplace like a police department a place that's way more forgiving for the use of cannabis among their staff. But at the same time, like how far does that go, and how do you balance that out? I think the issues that Drew mentioned are really interesting, though. Of what do you do about the forklift operator who tests positive right now, but it's Monday noon? What was that about?
Right. So many issues. It's a really deep policy area, and there's a lot of stuff to work out here, but we'll see. I mean, we'll see. I think this sort of breathes new life into maybe they pass a bill this year just based on that sponsor line, but a lot of complicated issues to work out for sure. And I want to touch on the Relief Act. We talked about this a lot last week, Michael and Drew, and the Senate is going to vote that bill out tomorrow. They added a bunch of money onto the governor's bill, but they did not change the governor's bill except for adding more to it. They didn't delete anything from the governor's bill. The House had a hearing on the bill today, and it looks like the goal here, this is the big stimulus package from the governor, a lot of money. The goal now is to get it done by February 14th. So quick turnaround, and that is to get this relief out as fast as possible to Marylanders, but also they need to give the comptroller time to get what they need to get to start sending checks out to folks, because there is a component here where certain individuals would be eligible for direct checks.
How sweet. Valentine's Day, right on time. They'll be like in a heart-shaped little box. That'll be adorable. I like it.
It'll be great. So this is another one where there are a lot of tricky issues, but this is moving quickly. So we will keep everybody updated, but this is another one that's going fast. And I had one more interesting observation today. Michael, this is not a county government issue. Drew, this is something where this is about taxes, and we like to talk about taxes, but generally we are interested in taxation when it affects county governments. But this bill is a millionaire's tax, and this is something that, we're not the only state that's considering this, but essentially this would add a 7% tax to anything over $1 million. This would not flow through to counties. This is just the state. But there were some, there's a really interesting policy argument here, and the one thing you hear a lot about any of these bills is, oh my gosh, well, if you tax the wealthy too much, they're just going to leave Maryland, right? Why would they stay here? They could go to West Virginia, Pennsylvania, or Florida, wherever, but why would the heck would they stay here and pay these taxes? And I thought Delegate Eric Lukey had a really interesting argument there, and he's basically said the state with the highest marginal income tax is California. And there are a bunch of millionaires in California. So he's saying, look, we can't just take that. It's not black and white. There are many reasons.
I don't know. I don't remember when the book came out, but How Money Walks by Travis Brown, maybe Travis Brown, I think, is sort of like the big rallying cry for the other side to try and take a look at all the people who have picked up and left this place and gone to that place. And if you chart it out by tax rates and other things like that, you find, lo and behold, lots of people have moved to places like Florida and Arizona and Nevada and Texas and so forth. And I don't know. It's interesting. Like, those places are warm and sunny, as well as potentially low tax. And I don't know, I don't know how you can separate out the multiple effects there, but I don't know, like the whole game of tax policy for purposes of economic development. We heard the governor this week talk about trying to change the way we tax retirement income as a way to make Maryland a more favorable or attractive place to retire to or to stay in. And this continuum of policy issues on where do taxes fit into our location decisions is just never ending, I think. So first week of February, and we talked about issue 1, we're not sure. Issue 2, we're not sure. Issue 3, well, we're not sure. Issue 4, we're not sure. Is that basic? I mean, this is pretty much situation normal for the first week of February, that session's in full swing. There's a lot on the table, and it's really hard to see from here to the end game of how this stuff all plays out. So, forgive us for having our crystal ball looks a little bit cloudy right now, but that is kind of where we sit.
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better than that.
Well, to try and put it a little better, we do know that something's going to happen on police reform. Something's going to happen on broadband. We just haven't ironed out the specifics, right? So I'm willing to wager some big cash that those two issues will be addressed. It's just a matter of filling in the pieces, right? So yes, session is in full swing, and we'll see. I mean, they are very busy. Things are crazy as normal, but yeah, it should be interesting. And I think we can go ahead and leave it there for the second edition of the podcast After Dark. Drew, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and thanks for filling us in on these issues that you're the lead on and you're really the expert on.
Thanks for having me, as always.
All right. So if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. Of course, follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Drew Jabin and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.